Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party supports this bill. Can I record my thanks in similar ways to that which the Minister's already said. Thank the government for consulting other parties, thank the other parties for their constructive engagement in respect of what should be or shouldn't be in this first of these bills. I think, sir, in respect of these three bills, the most contentious in the end will be the third one, which we're considering later in the week, which hands over some regulation-making power to the executive to override statutes in a way which is unusual. I think we've learned some lessons from the Canterbury earthquake and that the inquiries that have been done by various arms of government and also by the Regulations Review Committee of this Parliament have come up with some changes to that which prescribe or limit the executive's power to override statutes in a way that's more robust than was in the Canterbury legislation, which I think was properly criticised at the time as perhaps going a bit far. Sir, dealing with the Hurunui Kaikoura Earthquake Emergency Relief Bill in particular, there are three main parts to this, and all of these three provisions are supported by the Labor Party. So the first deals with the really publicly owned infrastructure, land that is and works that are within the control of the local authorities as opposed to within the control of private people, network utilities and particularly those that are necessary for the support of life. And it relaxes the rules that are in the Resource Management Act. There are already powers under the Resource Management Act at sections 330, 330A and 330B which confer powers to carry out emergency works, but the timeframes for both the carrying out of that work, for the notification to the local authority when that sort of emergency work is done, and for then, where necessary, the application for a retrospective resource consent to legitimise it going forward, they're a bit short, and some of those timeframes, for example, are only 20 working days. The next 20 working days includes the Christmas period, and I think the Minister is right to want to extend the date for the giving of advice from to the to the consent authorities from 7 to 40. Sorry, I think it was. What is it? Is it 10 working days presently? It's being extended to 40 working days, and the time frame for applying for a resource consent has been extended to 120 working days, sir. I think both of that's right. So the next part, which relates to certain activities from rural landowners or occupiers, is currently limited, as is the first part, to the Hurunui District, the Kaikoura District, the Marlborough District and the Canterbury Regional District. This is narrower than the first part, which also relates to the Wellington area, but in respect of these emergency activities by private land owners or occupiers in the Hurunui, Kaikoura, Marlborough or Canterbury Regional Council areas, there are certain activities which are deemed to be permitted, which, and were it not for this legislation, would theoretically require a resource consent. We suggested to the government that if we were going to confer this power to rural land occupiers and owners to take emergency preventative or remedial actions, that they had to be reasonable, and the government's agreed to insert the word reasonable grounds in section 10(1)A. I understand, sir, that there may be some other suggestions from other political parties that we consider during this brief period at Select Committee, but I think that's reasonable. I was down at Culverton myself last week, and it was actually there before they had their worst of their shakes. It was a few hours before, but even in respect of the earlier shakes that they had, I was on some farms, I'd seen some of the tanks that had fallen over, and I also heard of problems that they've had with some waterworks. Irrigation works, and I recognise that there is a need for a practical way for these farmers to go about their business, and I think that's appropriate. So the third part relates to the the dredging work that is needed in respect of Kaikoura Harbour. And I think everyone's seen the footage on TV where what used to be the land relative to water and entry into the water, what was showing at low tide is now the levels at high tide. So there's been a considerable uplift of the seabed, and it is necessary to dredge. I'm not sure how serious the work's. I'm not sure whether explosives will be necessary. I'm not sure whether they'll just be able to dredge it or dig it. I've seen some pretty big rocks there, which I suspect might require some explosives. I see already some reference here to requiring what's done to have as little impact on the marine environment and its flora and flora is reasonably practical, and that's already written into the bill. What happens is that this activity, the dredging, becomes a controlled activity, which means that so long as they are acting according to the controlled activity rules that the council requires of them, they don't need a resource consent. They can just do it as a controlled activity rather than having to advertise and go through some longer process to authorise it, sir. And as a consequence, I think that is wise as well, and the Labour Party will support it. I know my colleague Grant Robertson said that Dennis O'Rourke from New Zealand First made a worthy contribution at this cross-party grouping where he suggested that there is some provision made that whatever it is dredged should have to be disposed of, if it's going to be disposed of at sea, in the place which has the least environmental adverse effect. That seemed to me to be a pretty practical suggestion as well, and I'm sure that's something that the Select Committee would be willing to have a look at. So, sir, this power in respect of the sea area, I suspect of all of these powers that have been conferred by Parliament today, will prove to be the most significant environmentally. And of course, we don't want, while we're restoring the harbour primarily for the benefit of tourism, we don't want to cause long-term harm to tourism by adversely affecting the flora and fauna, including the whales and seals and dolphins that are the tourist attraction that we're trying to provide access to. That's already written into this piece of legislation, sir, and I also know that the people who are to be consulted as part of the controlled activity process include the local council, the local Runanga, the local iwi, and all of us know that the local whale watch is owned by and run by the local Runanga, and they will of course have their own interest in not going too far in respect of these emergency works. Sir, I don't think I need to take the full 10 minutes here, sir. I think that this is a necessary piece of legislation. I think it is appropriately constrained geographically. I note that the government has left it open to be added to add other regions or councils to the ambit or to the geographic areas that are covered by this bill should we have aftershocks or other parts of this earthquake sequence affecting other districts. The government's reserved the right to extend this to them by regulation, and given the earthquake activity we are seeing following this series of quakes, I think that's wise as well.